Okay, first things, let's talk about tinning the end of a piece of wire. Tinning is very important because it'll show you how solder works before you actually touch the piece that you're going to be working on. So I have my hot iron right here. I've got some silver bearing solder, and I've got a piece of wire that I want to tin. Okay, so I've already stripped the ends of the wire here just a little bit, as you can see. Okay, now what we're going to do is we're going to always heat the piece first. Do not heat the solder. The solder will obviously melt easily. That's not what we want. We want the piece hot enough so that the solder flows onto it. So I'm going to just rest the piece right here on the tip and then test every once in a while to see if the solder, the piece is hot enough to make the solder flow into it. It's not quite yet. There it goes. Whoop. And you notice it just went, it went from copper to silver in the matter of just a hair of a second there. That's all it takes. As soon as the copper is hot enough, the solder will flow right into it. You do have to be careful that the tip of your soldering iron doesn't get too much loose solder on it, because sometimes it can help you, help it flow, but sometimes it can make it seem like you've actually got the piece tinned when it's not. That solder is going to flow up into that copper that's all braided and twisted up in there, just like a sponge, or like a wet, a towel over a puddle. We're going to do it again. We're going to finish this up. You notice I've got a little ball of solder there on the end of the soldering iron. And that's okay. Sometimes it can help, but again, if it doesn't actually flow, you end up just heating the piece and not actually getting the solder in there. See, that's not very good. I didn't do a very good job on that one. I think we can do that again. So I'm going to heat it away from the solder that's on the tip. Make sure it's nice and heated up. And then I'm just going to test with the solder that I have, my new solder, and make sure that we get it nice and tinned and it flows. There we go. Done. You do have to be careful with soldering pieces of wire, because the insulation there can melt very easily, and you'll know you've got too much. You put too much heat into a piece, or you've had it on there for too long, or you've had low heat over a long amount of time, because that'll start to shrink on you, and that's not good. So hopefully you get the right amount of heat. There it goes. See? Flow. Now you just need to go back and trim off what you don't need for the job at hand. So I'm going to trim this to about 1/8 of an inch, maybe, or so, because the piece that I'm soldering to is about yay big, and I don't necessarily need it to be any larger than that, and I certainly don't want it to overhang, because then it could actually touch another part of the circuit, which would be bad. Alright, let's talk about soldering to an actual piece now. The most important thing here is to make sure that you have your piece steady, because you are going to be touching it with the soldering iron, and you don't want to have to use the soldering iron as a piece of leverage. So do whatever you can to weight that down. It could be anything. You can just put something, either clamp it down or even tape it down to a bench or something like that. I'm going to just use a piece of tile that I had laying around, just to make this a little bit more stable. Now you'll note I've already soldered one of these contacts here, and I'm just going to show you what I did to do that. Now the stuff that you might be soldering may already have some solder on it, and that's fine. You just don't want too much. But similar to tinning the end of a piece of wire, you want to heat the piece first. So we're going to hold this on here, and we're just going to test and test and test until the solder actually begins to flow onto the piece and not onto the tip of the soldering iron. So there you have it. That's pretty much it. You don't want to have too much on there, obviously. Just enough for your tinned piece of wire to actually be able to flow into it. Again, we want to have, when we actually solder these this piece of wire onto the piece itself, we actually want the solder to flow between the two pieces. We don't want what is known as a cold joint, where the solder has not flowed in between both the piece that you're soldering to and the actual wire itself. So you have to make sure that the solder on both the piece and the wire are actually flowing and hot and molten, essentially. So that's what we're going to do right now. So again, we're going to heat the piece up. And so try not to touch, if you can. Try not to touch the tip to the wire itself, and you'll know when it starts flowing. It actually changes colors a little bit, and then you can just set the wire into it. You can watch how the color of the wire changes as well. Remove the iron, things start to cool back down, and then ta-da, we're done. That's it. The other thing is it's going to always be a little tough to actually get the piece to stay, or get now that you've soldered it and you've kind of locked in like this one side, it can be kind of hard to manipulate these other pieces. So it might be good for you to have like a pair of tweezers or a pair of pliers or something like that, just to be able to manipulate that object into place, or manipulate that other wire into place. Sometimes there's like a third hand you can get, like the little magnifying glass with a pair of clips on it, for example. I don't necessarily need to do this for this piece, but I'm going to wait for it to flow, and then we're done. Ta-da! There we go. So, as you can see here, you can tell when something is soldered fairly well, and I don't know if I necessarily have it on the black wire. You can tell it just looks like one cohesive piece, right? You can see that the molten lava, or molten solder rather, has flowed well into the wire, etc. Now, even if you do have a substandard soldering joint, it could still work, and it may continue to work, but over time, as the piece gets moved, etc., if there's strain put on that soldering joint, it will at some point fail, you see. So I'm going to try to resolder that black one again, and we'll see if I can do a better job this time. Okay. All right, going to hit it again. More heat. Again, trying to keep us away. There it goes. Boom. All right, I got it to flow real nice that time.